Thank you very much, Craig. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's meeting. This meeting is being recorded and live streamed. Please can you keep your microphones on mute throughout, as this will prevent audio feedback, as we've just experienced. The chat function for those online shouldn't be used to have conversations or to provide any kind of personal information or responses. All chat is recorded due to the nature of this being a formal meeting. Please only use that chat function to alert me or officers if you wish to speak or raise a point of order or to report technical problems. There are some fabulous officers online, Mario, who can assist if need be. Thank you, Mario. As said before, this is a formal meeting, so please note that the press may be online recording what happens or taking notes of what happens, with the ability, obviously, to publish anything they see of interest. In terms of apologies, we've had apologies from Councillor Rathbone and Councillor Selman. I think that's it. We don't have any commission members online, although we do have officers. Agenda item 2, are there any urgent items in respect of the order of business or relating to any issues? No, thanks very much. Agenda item 3, declarations of interest. Does anybody have any declarations of interest in respect of any items of the agenda this evening? No, not in respect of this, no. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Yep, I'd like to declare I work for a housing association. Do I need to name? Clarion Housing Group.
Thank you, Councillor Ogunde Muren. Moving on to our substantive item on the agenda this evening. Agenda item 4, meeting the council's net zero target with regard to retrofitting. This evening, the Commission is keen to hear about the progress made in retrofitting and promoting better energy use across council-owned and managed housing stock, and in encouraging retrofit and energy monitoring across housing association, private rented sector, and owner-occupied housing stock. The Commission sees this discussion as timely given the adoption of Hackney's Climate Action Plan in May 2023, in which retrofit is identified as a key priority. The Commission is also keen to follow up on its previous work on retrofitting as part of the Scrutiny panel's overarching net zero review and review progress against the Council's objective since. In attendance for the first portion of this item, we have Councillor Cleon Mackenzie, Cabinet Member for Housing Services and Resident Participation in person. Thank you very much. Sinead Burke, Head of Property and Asset Management online, and James Goddard, Strategic Head of Strategy Assurance and Private Rented Sector, again in person. Thank you very much. Also online, we've got Director Ricardo Hayat. We're not sure whether you're here to just observe at this stage or whether you will be participating, but thank you nevertheless for being here. We've also, unfortunately, we've received apologies from Councillor Semawema, Deputy Cabinet Member for Private Rented Sector and Housing Affordability, and Steve Waddington, Strategic Director for Housing Services. We've allocated around 45 minutes for each service area, that being corporate portfolio and then housing association and private rented sector. And we look to council-owned and managed housing stock first, before moving on to housing associations and private rented sector and owner-occupied housing stock. I'd now like to invite Councillor Mackenzie and Sinead Burke to give a brief overview of their presentation on the progress in retrofitting council-owned and managed housing stock, which was submitted in advance of the meeting. You have around 10 minutes for this presentation. Feel free to start when you're ready.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everyone. Hackney Council is committed to achieving net zero by 2040 for all of its housing stock. It's a very important strategic target for us. In addition to the significant reduction in council climate emissions, it will mean our homes will be cheaper to run, offer good thermal comfort for residents, and be much more resistant to damp and mould. Officers have carried out valuable research on the technical potential to retrofit our homes, and as planned are now moving to begin pilot projects. Last year, we published a new resident engagement strategy, which will lend an important framework to how we work with residents. This is not only a technical project, we need to ensure that residents are fully engaged and considered in the programme. We shouldn't underestimate the challenges. This programme will be the biggest transformation of council housing in our lifetime. It will change how our homes look, how they're used, and it will require really significant levels of investment, levels that we can't currently afford. We're making all available use of grant funds, but unfortunately, this is not enough. It's important that we ensure that we are ambitious, but also careful in our progress. We need to make sound investment decisions and be sure new technology in construction is reliable, user-friendly and effective. At this time, we cannot compromise with either fire safety or routine maintenance. With this said, I'll now pass you over to Sinead Burke, Head of Property and Asset Management, who will take you through our retrofit presentation and hopefully take some questions after that. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor. Chair, am I good to start the presentation?
Please go ahead.
Excellent, and you can hear me okay, I assume. Okay, so the presentation, we've submitted the slides, and so we've answered a set of key questions which were put to us. I'm just going to talk through those now, and I'll just assume that I'll just talk through from start to finish, and then we'll do questions at the end. So very quickly, this first slide shows some of the progress that we've made since the last update. So we've done a stage one, what we call a REBA stage one feasibility study for a possible net zero retrofit project. At the moment, we're still looking in detail at the option appraisal that's come out of that, because there's a lot of different ways of achieving this, the different technical ways you can do it, but the costs are often very, very high. We have also made a successful bid for wave 2 of the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. So we've been allocated grant funding worth up to a potential 4.5 million with improvements to 550 homes. We're working at the moment to appoint consultants to manage this project and contractors to deliver the work. It's a very tight timescale though. The SHDF comes out in waves, and you really need to be very ready for those. And this is a huge program that we've put together because most of those homes are street properties. So we're going to try to maximise anyway the number of homes that can benefit. But as Councillor Mackenzie has said, we're continuing to apply to all available funds, and we'll go into further waves. We anticipate further waves of this fund, which we will bid for as we need and as they arise. We've also had a recent successful £100,000 bid to improve the efficiency of one of our communal heat networks. And we anticipate that the learning that we get out of that is probably going to be relevant to other networks to improve the energy efficiency that we get off those. On to slide 2, we have some notes on alignment to wider council goals. So the targets that we're working to in housing are very much the targets that the council has set more broadly. So we're working to the 2040 net zero target. And within that, we have an interim target, which is noted in the Climate Action Plan, which is that we'd like to get our homes to an average of a B EPC Energy Performance Certificate rating by 2030. The internal governance arrangements that we have are linked into the wider internal governance arrangements. So council-wide, we have what's called the Environmental Sustainability Board, and below that we have a housing retrofit group. We have a strategic group, I suppose, where we take on kind of more broad questions such as funding models, resident engagement, etc. So things that are questions of how we approach an issue, I suppose, and often take in lots of areas across housing. But then we also have some much more operational groups focused on really technical staff who are trying to answer questions around, do we do certain types of fabric retrofit? Should we invest in this kind of new mechanical system, etc.? So we have those different layers of working groups and governance trying to bring this project together. Third slide is around some timeline and key milestones. So obviously we're working to the 2030 target to get an average of a B. And net zero by 2040, which is really soon. I mean, it's already 2023. I can't believe it, but it actually is. So that gives us 7 years to 2030 and only 17 years to 2040. It's an enormous challenge. Some progress we've made already is it's largely been around research. We had already always planned at the very start that we would have to do a lot of research to start off. Then we would do pilot phase, and we're sort of moving into that pilot phase now, and then there would be what we call kind of a full wider rollout. The research that we've done, some of it is listed there. It's quite hard to do. We've got quite complex stock, so it's been quite challenging to do some of this work, but there's some really useful figures that have come out of it, such as the fact that already we're on just about an average of a C already. And between 2010 and 2020, we've had about a half so in the EPC performance bandings, you've got his A, B, C, D performance bands, and we've improved about half a band in 10 years. So we need to speed that up to get to 2030, but it's not nothing, so it's good that we're able to see where that progress has been. And like I said, we're working on some new pilot projects. The next stage that we have, or the next slide, is around financial implications and opportunities. So this is really where this becomes really, really challenging. I mean, technically there are some challenges to this, but largely they're kind of, to a greater extent, sort of understood. It's just about applying them to different buildings. But the financial challenge is really one that is really hard to see how we're going to do it in some ways. The initial work that we've had shows that it's an enormous amount of money to bring a home to a net zero standard. The level of investment to completely essentially redo the entire fabric of the building and its heating system, it's just enormous. When it comes to housing, as opposed to, say, the corporate stock, we've got a lot of additional implications around leasehold homes. So sometimes lease terms say that we shouldn't really be recharging for what they call improvement works we don't just have to do to maintain the building. Grant funding that we can get can often be quite low compared to the overall work. So sometimes under the SHDF, for example, it seems like the grant funding is 50%. But actually what it means is they'll fund up to 50%. And up to a cap of maybe, I don't know, £5,000 or £10,000, and you have to fund everything beyond. So it's not unusual for us to find a scheme where, we might be getting £8,000 worth of funding, but we'd need to do 40 grand's worth of work to collect it, and that's hard to balance. The grant funding arrangements often come with really, really specific requirements, which bring just a lot of additional complexity, additional work, moving things around, etc. And then finally, a note that we always like to make sure that we're not adversely affecting fuel poverty, but we often find that that's not clear cut how it works on some of the low carbon heating systems, because they rely on electricity rather than gas. And electricity has this higher kilowatt hour cost. It can be a little bit difficult to see a translation in low carbon heating feeding through to lower fuel bills, and we just need to make sure that we're keeping track of both those issues. So that's some of the issues around financial implications. Next slide is around resident engagement. So we've done fairly limited resident engagement because, as I said, we're only just starting our initial pilot projects, but we're developing engagement plans at the moment for works that we're planning under this social housing decarbonisation grant work. As Councillor Mackenzie mentioned in his introduction, we will be using the resident engagement strategy as a kind of a framework for how we approach that work. And what we're also doing is we're working with our colleagues in regeneration. They're doing some really interesting work around post-occupancy evaluation. Now, obviously, those aren't retrofitted homes, but they are homes that are built to very high new standards of energy efficiency. And it will be useful in informing how residents find these kind of buildings, you know, because often the heating systems are really quite different to what we're used to. And so the idea there is to understand how people find using these systems. Do they find problems with ventilating the homes, with overheating sometimes in highly retrofitted homes? And we're hoping that a lot of that lessons learned there will help us to work in our engagement on retrofit projects. The final slide then is around embedding technical knowledge. So we're part of a London Councils group on retrofit, so we're sharing lots of research and experience with other London councils, because obviously they'll be facing a lot of the same challenges, and a lot of the things that they found that have been useful and interesting are things that we can learn from as well. We have trained quite a few officers in my team to be retrofit assessors. So retrofit assessment is a new standard that's been brought out. So there's been a new national standard on how to run a retrofit project and make sure that the measures that you are using are the kind of most appropriate measures for the building and complement one another. And so we've trained several officers in that standard, and we're also continuing to work with contractors and through our procurement exercises to make sure that the contractors we have are qualified properly to do this retrofit work and to maintain some of these new systems that we have, because a lot of the new systems, particularly the heating systems, are very different to older ones, but we have to make sure we have the right kind of contractors to do that work. Finally then, on the last slide, I have how we report the progress. So the key metrics that we're using the EPC. It's a national standard. So that's the Energy Performance Certificate. That's the thing that you find if you buy or rent a home. It has to be advertised with the property. It's not perfect, but it is a national standard, and it's the basis of our 2030 targets. So we're very much using it. Within the EPC, or the Energy Performance Cert, it also shows you the carbon intensity of the home. So we're using that as a basis to estimate carbon emissions. And that work is being reported through these working groups that I mentioned previously, but also it's informing work that we're doing this year to make a roadmap, a long-term roadmap towards 2040, and to build in maybe more formal reporting around this target. In terms of processes, the key process that we're using is this PAS 2035 standard. So it's a standard that's been brought in about maybe 2-3 years ago into the construction industry, and so it's to make sure that these kind of projects are run properly. So, for example, one of the concerns that people have when you do retrofit projects is that you maybe do a lot of work which reduces the ventilation in the building, and consequently then that you might have more problems with mold potentially within the building. Or that you do partial retrofit, and so one part of the building is really, really warm, and the other part then is disproportionately cold in relative terms. And so what this standard does is, apart from sort of bringing in qualification into the industry, it shows the measures that are suitable to a different home and are complementary, to make sure that we're not just a hodgepodge slapping insulation around the place. It's actually really carefully considered into making sure that the home is still working properly. So that would be our key process. It's relatively new in the industry, like I said. And then more broadly, an awful lot of this work is going to depend on things that happen outside of Hackney. Obviously, we have to work within the construction industry and how that is developing and maturing as more and more of this work takes place. But there's also massive interaction with essentially the grids, the energy grids. So We are dependent in that net zero target on the electricity grid decarbonising, which is something that, you know, we see happening, but obviously we need to make sure that that is happening. And we've also been in regular contact with Cadent, for example, because they are still exploring an opportunity for hydrogen to be used in place of gas. So these are kind of wider conversations that we're having with some utility suppliers and keeping in mind on the wider national progress. Hackney can't net zero on its own. It needs to move to net zero in the context of a wider industry which is moving that way as well. So that is a very, very quick overview because it's 10 minutes and I think I even went over that, but I hope it gives some basis for questions at least.
Thank you very much, Sinead. Oh, we've got Steve. Oh, Steve, oh, you're quick off the mark. So, Steve, sorry, I can't remember your surname. We've got Steve, he's part of the residents.
Steve Webster.
Steve White, thank you very much.
Webster.
Steve, how are you doing?
Go ahead, Steve, sorry.
Oh, hi there. Yeah, I was quick. Thank you. Thanks to Councillor Mackenzie and to Sinead for making that presentation. So I have a question. I have two questions for both. First of all, around resident engagement. Yeah, it's really good to hear that, you know, your plans to involve residents in discussion around the decarbonisation fund and the related works. Yeah. Are you planning to provide further details around how that will take place? You talked that would be within the framework of the resident engagement strategy, but when you've got firmer plans, will you be sharing that with the Living in Hackney Scrutiny and the RLG? That's my first question. The second question is around the heat network efficiency fund. Yeah, what practical and financial benefits will there be for residents from any financial payback that the council receive by that source of funding? Thank you.
Okay, so the first question is, yes, we can share our plans to engage with residents on the SHDF. At the moment, it's still in a phase where we're working with what are called delivery partners. So these are consultants which the government hire to operate the fund. And there's some key questions that we're still unpicking with them about how this fund exactly works. So there's some details that we're picking through to make sure that we can pass on the right information to residents, and also to make sure that we understand the extent to which we can have, I would say, Steve, you know, we've talked about this idea, where can we consult with residents on what we do, and where do we have to inform them about things? So, for example, what's not absolutely clear yet is the extent to which we can consult with residents on their best impressions on what is the best improvement for the energy efficiency in their home. Because it might be that a resident would like X and Y types of work, but the retrofit standard says that those are not compatible. So we really want to make sure that we unpick and are really clear early on, you know, we can talk to you around this, these are things that are optional, but we are going to have to do this because the fund and the process requires it. So we're just trying to make sure that we unpick that, so that when we work with people, we're clear on saying, this is where we can talk to you and have some discussions about your preference and maybe your kind of what you think about it, but this is where it's something that we are just going to have to do. So if we're still sort of working with the delivery partner to unpick some of the details, we've done some early initial retrofit assessments to test out some different property typologies, but we can share that information with you when we get to it. Oh, sorry, and my second question, sorry, I forgot about the second one. The second one was about the carbon, the communal heating grant. Wasn't that it, Steve? So the
Heat Network Efficiency Fund.
Yeah, so the benefit there is that, so when we run our communal heating systems, obviously you've got your boiler house, which I say in a regular domestic, what we call domestic heating system, it's within your property, and all the pipes run around within your property, and that's fine. When we've got communal one, we've got the boiler out off in a plant room, you've got all these pipes bringing the heat to different homes. And along the way, those pipes lose some heat. So what this study is going to help us to do, well, first of all, we've been putting meters in now for quite some time on our heat networks. And that's really useful because it's been able to start to give us a picture of how efficient they are. But what this project in particular is going to do is they're going to do lots more meters very in detail around the buildings and around the network. So maybe each floor in a block or something. And they are going to look at measures exactly where the heat is being lost and where it's going. There are also things within communal heating systems, which now I'm not a mechanical engineer and I can't explain the full detail of it, but there's things about when the load from the demand is high. So when lots of residents, for example, are having a shower, it's more efficient to have the boilers operating in a certain mode. But when there's low demand, like in the summer when there's very little demand, you want the boilers to be on a reduced output. So it's about balancing the boiler. They're more efficient if they're very well balanced between the demand and what they're putting out. You don't want them piping hot water around the pipes all day and nobody is using it. And so what it does is it starts to look at the demand in time on your network and also where the losses are. We're just going to get this study done in detail across one network, but we hope that, people are kind of similar, people have similar kind of demands across the states, and it will help us to balance those boilers better. So what we should hope to find is a communal heating service which is more efficient to run.
Thanks, Sinead. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Sinead. I've got a question. It's just a quick one, really. I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but it's just in respect of our ambitions for 2014, all housing stock to have undergone these kind of works. Given the inadequate funding and the lack of it more generally, how realistic do we think these ambitions, although they're the correct ambitions to have, are? Do you think it's likely that we are going to meet them? And within that, what other sources of funding, whether it's green loans or whatever, are being looked at to kind of facilitate this necessary work?
I suppose, I mean, Councillor Mackenzie might want to come in about, lobbying and things like that, but I would say that it's very hard to tell because the world is going to change in 17 years. And I can't really tell you how much it's going to change. If you looked at the world 17 years ago, which was when 2006, even then, social media networks did not exist. Facebook did not exist. Twitter did not exist. It's really hard to predict. The approach that we're taking within the team, at least, and what we're working with directors, with Councillor Mackenzie on, is we at least need to, for the start, really understand the size of that problem, because that's a really, really big thing to define, first of all, and really have a good understanding of what we might need to do initially so that when these funding rounds become available, we're able to take advantage of them. Because it's been a bit of a lesson recently, is that if you're not ready to jump on them, you miss out. But that's why I suppose Councillor Mackenzie is probably talking about needing to be careful as well as being ambitious, because you can run after this stuff and invest when technology is changing very quickly. You can invest too early in a technology which then doesn't become the kind of the lead one that wins out in the end of the day. So we just need to make sure that we're doing this carefully. But can we do it? I mean, Ricardo has got his hand up, so he might actually answer that question rather than myself. Ricardo, I'll go over to you.
Ricardo, would you please give us your full title, please, as well? I know it's a long one.
And thank you very much for allowing me to join the discussion. So my full title is Group Director for Climate, Homes and Economy. And just to add to what Sinead has said, one of the things that we are doing is, in terms of funding opportunities, we are starting to do that horizon scanning a lot better than we were before, so that we've got to look at what's coming on stream. And as well as putting bids forward, it's thinking quite carefully about whether or not we'll be able to meet the requirements of the different funding pots, and also that we have the capacity internally to be able to deliver the programs associated with them. but I've certainly been clear that we need to be on our guard and need to be prepared for funding opportunities that do arise. So, to answer a part of your question, at this point in time, nothing's off the table, but we just need to be mindful that we're able to deliver what we bid for. There's a practical point here as well, is, when you think about it, we're one of the biggest landlords in London. Think of the size of our stock, and even if we did have all of the funding that we needed to retrofit our stock, and let's say all the other social landlords had that funding as well, there is an issue with technical capacity in the sector. Going out to procurement, there's only a certain number of contractors that would be able to take on jobs of that scale, and that's before you bring in all the major housing associations. So, as you said, it's right to be ambitious, and we have to be, pending the availability of that funding. And while we are doing that, as Sinead said, we're really working hard to understand the state of our stock and think about where we can, bring our capital improvement programs together to maximise delivery of efficient homes. But equally, and I'm sort of a glass half empty character myself. We can't underestimate, the scale of the challenge. But we stand ready if the funding ever becomes available. But the reality of it is, I think it's highly unlikely.
Thank you very much for your feedback on that. What James Goddard wanted to come in.
Thanks, Councillor. Well, Ricardo left me a hospital pass there, didn't he, on that last one? But I'm getting my retaliation in first. You're going to hear some of this on my presentation again. The conversation here on council stock isn't dissimilar to that when we look at owner-occupiers and private rented. I'm not going to pull punches. You'll see some of the figures. You've already seen them in this report. You'll see them again. Government talks about bonds. It talks about green banks. It talks about all this stuff till the cows come home. It's not there yet. It's nowhere near that. I can't pull punches. Yep. We're putting bids in. We're keeping things. There's a way to go. You saw the reports over the weekend about where the country is with its targets. I'm being even more glass empty than Ricardo is, for sure. But the fact is, at the same time, this conversation is about that little bit of the stock. And when you get onto my bit, you're going to see, when I say my bit, when you get onto the broader things and some of the funding things that we'll talk about there a bit more, what can and can't happen. I think Ricardo and Sinead are right. We've got to look for this. It's correct to have the ambition. When you see some of the figures, got to take a little step back and realise, that's how we prioritise that. Final point. Quite a lot tonight you'll hear don't knows from us. Normally officers sit here and we talk till the cows come home. But a lot of this stuff is still at this stage, even though we've only got 7 years to do one bit and 17 for the other. A lot really is current conversations, live stuff. We lobby the government on this nearly weekly on some of these policy points. So I'm just generically pointing out that you'll see some of the figures in my bit. I'll shut up unless there's a question.
Thank you, James. Councillor Mackenzie.
Yeah, I'm going to say something which officers are too polite to say in regard to kind of like whether or not, with the existing financial and political and policy regime, whether we feel confident we're going to get to net zero in 2040. The answer to that, the existing regime, we're not. But I'm feeling optimistic. I'm feeling optimistic not because of the existing regime, but actually policy and actually the impetus to maybe change that financial and policy regime may change in the next 18 months or so. So it's a judgment call you're going to have to make in terms of, like, if you're talking purely operational, the constraints which we're operating at the moment, if we carry on the same path we are at the moment, the likelihood with the regimes and money available, we're not going to achieve it. But there's a greater thing to play in with just the operational stuff. Obviously, it relates to politics and whether the politics and the policy attitude towards sustainability are going to fundamentally change. And I'm optimistic.
Thank you for the ray of sunshine, Councillor Mackenzie. Okay, but Councillor Maxwell, Councillor Sadek, and then Councillor Garbett.
Thanks. I think this is probably for Sinead. I wanted to go back to the section about resident implications, because I feel a bit concerned that I know we can't do resident engagement yet. but I'm trying to remember, we had a resident satisfaction survey a few months ago. Councillor Mackenzie might remember it. And one of the things that really struck me was it was the people on our estates who had the least confidence around our green and environmental work and least trust. And I'm trying to remember that. And I think if we're to bring people along with us, when we're looking at, you know, it's less clear about the benefit and potentially high costs. This is a really big thing for people on low incomes on our estates, that they could be having higher costs. I think, you know, this is something we've got to get right, and we've got to look at the implications for people, because you can't, it's a very different situation on some of our estates, having the retrofitting, having recycling, having carbon heating systems, to something with a street property with a garden and a higher income. And so I think that does need to be looked at more, because I don't know if we can try and dig out that part of the survey, but it was quite notable that where the council had the least satisfaction was with people on our estates, and it was around environmental issues. And I think it'd be very hard to try and say to somebody, this is really good for the, you know, for the environment, but actually you're going to be paying a lot more when people are really struggling. And I think that does link into the resident engagement, and it also links in a bit to the impact, because we've talked a lot about what we're going to do to the buildings, but not a lot about the impact on the people living there of any changes that are going to happen. So I think that's probably for Sinead, but it might be for Councillor Mackenzie. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a really fair point, and it's one that we have been discussing a lot internally. In fact, I don't know that I've seen that survey, but you know, I can see we often get results from estates that are different to Hackney in general. One thing I will say is there's a few principles that we're trying to take in our groups, in this housing working group. One of them is that we're taking what's called a fabric first approach by default. That's kind of one that's quite common in the industry. So it's the idea being that you retrofit the building fabric, so you add your insulation, you make you reduce the amount of energy that the home needs by making it more insulated, and then you move it to a low carbon heating system. An alternative would be to say that you just take the property as it is, you put in an air source heat pump, so it's what's called a lower carbon heating system, but it still takes a lot of energy to run, you know, so fabric first, you're actually really trying to reduce the amount of energy, and then also reduce the carbon emissions associated with that energy use, if that makes sense. And that's really beneficial. First of all, it's kind of a better way of doing it overall for various slightly detailed technical reasons that I won't go into. But secondly, it can really, it's the element that really helps with the heating bills. But beyond that, what I've challenged the team working on this research to do, they're working on the fabric retrofit researchers, have said, we're not able to articulate really bills as a benefit, because we don't necessarily kind of pay them. We don't know what kind of energy people are using. We know that lots of people do not heat their homes properly, you know, so a lot of people are already maybe not going to see a lot of heating savings from this, because they are completely inadequately heating their homes at present. So what very often happens when you do retrofit, in fact, we know, is you get what's called rebound effect. So people heat their homes more. They've kind of got a budget for heating and they heat their homes more. So what I've said to the team is, what is the benefit if it's not reducing energy bills? And that's where we're starting to try to bring our focus and our thinking to things like thermal comfort, things like being able to heat the home easily, because that's the kind of more tangible benefit that you can bring to someone and talk to them about it. So it's not that fear of, you know, you've gone out, it was cold all day, you come home at 6 o'clock in the evening and the house is really cold because you weren't able to leave it on the little kind of top-up heating all day. Actually being able to come home and feel like you can come home to the house and it's already warm because it's really quick to heat. So those are the kind of benefits that we're trying to think through. Also things like being able to protect the home from damp and mold. And in terms of the heating systems, the new kind of heating systems that we will have to put in, we do recognise that we need to make sure that we work with people properly to make sure that they understand them fully, because a lot of them do work just that little bit differently to how you're used to working a standard gas boiler. So there's a lot of thinking that's gone on in the background, but I'd say the key to it is to know is that fabric first approach, which is what we hope is the best approach for residents in our buildings.
Thank you, Sinead. Okay, I was going to ask another question, but I'll move on to Councillor Sadek. Go on, sorry.
You can ask it. You sure? Thanks, Chair. I've got two questions. Is that all right?
Yeah.
The first one, I think, Sinead, if I've understood your answer there correctly, you've touched on partly already. But I just wondered how this retrofit work will combine with other major sort of regeneration investment in the council's housing stock. Is that your question? in the years to come, we all know as councillors that issues, whether it's general disrepair or damp and mould or other issues that residents bring to our attention, it's happening. It's commonplace, and there are various bits of regeneration work that will be going on in the years ahead in relation to that, regardless of retrofit.
Mm-hmm.
So, what thinking is being done, or what planning is being done by the council to ensure that these two major projects or investments dovetail and, to the extent possible, sort of kill two birds with one stone? So that's question one. The second question was to do with embedding technical knowledge slides that you talked about, and how we use, which I'm slightly broadening the content of that slide here, but how we use this as a sort of opportunity to really benefit the local community in terms of employment opportunities in the local economy. I didn't see anything in the bits on contractors in that slide about sort of, well, I don't know the granular details of it, but would it be possible, for example, to make it a condition or one of the factors that are considered when going through the procurement process to ensure that a certain level of the employment and the sort of upskilling of people doing this work are people from Hackney, and use this as an opportunity to sort of stimulate the local economy in a way that benefits, in an employment sense, local people, particularly, to go to Councillor Maxwell's point, residents that are, it'd be fantastic if residents that were living on some of these estates that were being retrofitted, major works, were able to benefit in that way from this.
Okay. Yeah, so question one is something that, again, okay, I mean, I'm glad James said we don't always know the answers, so now I can say that. But what we are by default, like I said, we're trying to work on a roadmap this year, and that roadmap, I suppose, is what we're not seeing it at the moment is just a chart that says 5% savings a year, but actually articulates a set of principles and articulates maybe a rate of improvement that we need to be achieving, so that we can see if we're sort of on that track, without sort of trying to say, well, in 2032 we're going to be doing these kind of improvements, because we're not. The world will change by then. I can't guess what we're going to be doing. But one of the things we have been looking at really is that we need to essentially very much tie these together. There's no way that I can really maintain stock and separately retrofit it, because very often they are the same thing. We are looking, as I said, at the start of the SHDF, Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund project, and one of the things we're looking at is that there's very often, trying to do cost planning and works planning and stuff, you often get very obviously connected items of work. So walls that need to be insulated cannot be damp. Obviously, you can't go around insulating a wall that's currently damp. So that means maybe these are street properties at the time, we might have to inject a damp-proof course. But there you're immediately getting into your damp retrofit or damp remedial works as part of a retrofit work. Another thing that we very often find is that you go into an attic space that hasn't been in for a while and you have to do asbestos removal or something. So it's going to have to be that it's connected to a wider programme. The details of that we don't have we're working on as part of the roadmap, but I think connected is the only way that it's going to really work. The risk we have the other way is, obviously, we've seen what happens when you do. I mean, I suppose, in some ways, when they retrofitted the Grenfell Tower, that was a great piece of work, maybe energy efficiency wise, but they forgot about the fire safety and it led to disaster. And it shows how we absolutely can't be going at a building and thinking about it as a fire safety project or an energy efficiency project or whatever. We need to think about it more broadly, because otherwise you risk dropping the ball on something else. I'll answer the second part, and then I see Ricardo's got his hand up, and I'll let him in on whichever bits he would be doing. In terms of the procurement, though.
Sorry, Sinead, Councillor Sadek's just got a follow-up to what you've just presented there.
It was just in light of that response and the
Yeah.
potential combination with the remedial work, for example, or fire safety or whatever else it combines with. Is that the estimated cost that you reference in your presentation, is that purely the retrofit work? And if so, sort of how confident are you in that figure not growing exponentially if you're going to combine it with other things?
What figure did I put in the presentation?
Maybe I've taken that from another source. I think it was 1.3 billion. I saw in a document I'd looked at.
Oh, not confident at all. If you've got a number in the billions, I would say not confident at all. I would say that multiplied by a number of units. Yeah, no, honestly, I don't mean to be sort of flippant about that, because it does sound like the kind of figure that we've done a few big pieces of work and we've multiplied it up and said, goodness, it might cost this much. We would not have done a costing across the stock to allow us to assess that. But generally speaking, at the moment, we are trying to work out, for example, grant funding, we are trying to work out those additional costs. But yeah, but often when I say it might cost 30 grand to get home from a B or C to a B rating, that is purely the energy efficiency works, and anything connected could be additional.
Sorry, Sinead, we've got another follow-up, and then is it okay if I bring Ricardo in? Because I think
yes,
he also
of
wants
course,
to respond to this.
whichever way you like, you're the chair.
Okay, go ahead, sorry.
Yep, hi. So my question was about, I guess, spheres of influence in regards to retrofitting. So I work in building safety in my day job, and I'm aware of the substantial costs of retrofitting, but I wanted to know what work is being done in terms of future properties that we're building and the sort of sustainability that we're incorporating into the design and energy efficiency of those buildings, because I think it's more cost effective to plan on sustainability of new builds as opposed to you've built them and then you're now having to retrofit them when you could have incorporated something in the beginning stages.
I know you're absolutely right. So I don't know off the top of my head now exactly what the regen standards are, but there are quite strict energy efficiency standards that are set up by the building regulations now for new build. And there are also additional requirements that they usually have to fulfill as part of the London plan. So there's usually across London new build requirements. I think, Ricardo, you might know more, but there's certain things where they can't have gas in buildings, like gas heat, boilers and heating. I think it's from 2025, and I think certainly our regen colleagues are planning at the moment not to build gas heating into new buildings. So that is absolutely the way they're going with the regen stock.
We did pad that question out a bit. Thank you, Councillor Gunda-Muren. We've got Ricardo who wanted to respond, but also James, if we can take you in that order, please.
Thank you, Chair. So just going back to Councillor Sadek's question, I think was around how we would take a holistic approach to works to existing stock, i.e. retrofitting existing stock, while also bringing forward new homes. Was that the crux of your question, Councillor Sadek?
It wasn't necessarily about the new homes part, actually, but
all right,
chance on that bit as well.
Yeah, well, as I've just asked myself a question, just to be clear, I think the biggest challenge it comes back to resources, actually, and I think Sinead touched on it earlier. There are, in terms of building new homes, There are standards set in the London Plan, and we will, endeavour or aspire to building homes to the highest possible efficiency standards. And to a large extent, it's much straightforward to do that when you're building homes from scratch. But I think the broader challenge is when you look at the council's own new build programme, a lot of it is on sort of infill development within existing estates. And there is always a challenge that we need to explore where we can bring forward that new development whilst delivering those new homes to the highest possible efficiency standards, while thinking about existing homes that are adjacent and seeing how we can improve those at the same time. So we do genuinely look to bring those programs together where we can. But again, there is a challenge around resources. I think you asked a second question, Councillor Sadiq, about procurement and whether or not we can place specific conditions on contractors to offer apprenticeships and opportunities for local people. So two things to say on that. So I'll start with a challenge. So because of the types of contractors that we're looking to procure and the requirement that they have sort of special sort of capabilities in order to deliver the newest and most efficient technologies, there is always a challenge about their ability to be able to bring in employ people to certain roles who may not have those capabilities up front. It doesn't mean that they can't bring and offer opportunities to local people who can be part of the projects, but that's just something that we have to bear in mind. And we will quite often set out through ordinary practice anyway, requirements through when we're procuring major capital works for sort of local supply chains to be examined and reviewed to see where opportunities can be offered locally. But I think with these projects, when we're talking about retrofit specifically, a key requirement will be that we do get the contractors on board with the requisite experience and capacity in order to deliver what are effectively new technologies. But yes, for our sustainable procurement strategies, we will always seek to ensure that there are requirements in what the contractors bid for, that they do seek to employ and offer opportunities to local people.
Thank you. We're going to have to wind up this element fairly soon. We've got 3 more questions, but I know James wants to come in terms of the regen.
Ricardo wanted it, Chair.
You're going to do it later. Okay. Thank you. So we've got 3 remaining. Councillor Garbutt, Councillor Palace and Councillor Joseph, please.
Thank you. And thank you for the honesty on the target. I'm just going to go back to the target. Because it'd be really good to understand what the kind of gap is. Like, if we're going to miss 2040, are we talking 2045? Are we talking 2060? And maybe that's what the roadmap's going to do. But it'd be really good to understand that, because I get that, I've been trying to look through other presentations we've had. My notes say that we've got 22,000 in our housing stock. I don't know if that's about right. That was in another document. Yeah, and obviously if you're doing 500 by 2025, yeah, it'd just be good to understand how off 2040 feels at the moment and what more we can be doing to kind of, advocate for that. And then there's been a couple of comments about the SHDS 2025 target being difficult, and I just wondered why that was, like what makes that a difficult, I know it's maybe the scale, but it would just be good to understand that. I did have another one just on why we use EPC and not the energy use intensity, so the EUI, which is more kind of more reliable in terms of energy use. So I just wondered about that one as well. Thank you.
Okay, so the roadmap is the thing that we really need to do a little bit more on to see how off we might be. However, in the presentation, you can see that we've moved, I suppose there's a slide that says we have moved from an average SAP figure. So the SAP is, I don't remember, standard assessment procedures, and it doesn't really matter. It's the EPC goes from 0 to 100. and it's divided into bands. So I think from about 55 to 70, for example, is a C. It's one of those kind of things. So we've moved from 63 to 70 in a decade. So we've moved, if we keep going at that rate, it'll take us, 4 decades. So that's what I'm saying, we got to hurry up. But I suppose that might give you some scale to that answer. But an awful lot of the final push to net zero is going to be driven by industry changes and by decarbonisation, which I think is sort of starting to happen. But anyway, the second question was
Areas to,
right. So the reason is that they just come out with these rules, and they just have an awful lot of rules that you have to fulfill. That's it. So sometimes there's lots of specific timescales. There's lots of specific, you can have these kind of properties, but not that one unless this happens. And then there's just quite a lot of rules around how they're set up. They require us to do an awful lot of reporting. We have to fill out huge numbers of documents for them every month to show how the program is going, and all of that takes an awful lot of time and resource. And I suppose they have to do it to show that the fund is being properly spent, but there's a huge amount of administration in it. They have to set up rules, but of course in setting rules, they might be not the ones you'd want to follow, or not want to follow, but they just mightn't suit you. So they have deadlines around things. So this wave is for 2 years. And why couldn't it have been 3? Maybe we might have said, well, the program that we're working on really works best over a 3-year program. This kind of work takes a long time. So it just means that you have to fulfill these kind of things. You also have to deliver like 40% of the work in year 1 at least, and then you can do 60% in year 2. So there's just quite a lot of little rules that you have to make sure that you're complying with is all. And it's there because I suppose they have to put rules around funding, and they have to show that these things are being spent the right way, but they just make it challenging. And they often mean that you need to shift your ways of working from what you're normally doing to suit this project, which also can be just a bit tricky. But it's just the administrative kind of way around it. And the final question is, why are we using EPC? The reason we're using EPC at the moment is just because we have a really good data set on it. So we're not using EPC, we're using EPC to benchmark the stock as a whole. So we can download from some website, it's publicly available, what all the EPCs are, which are lodged. So whenever somebody sells or rents their home, that information is on a database, but we can make use of that information. So suddenly we have EPCs for, I think we have EPCs for nearly half of our stock at the moment. Some of them are older, maybe less useful, but we have an awful lot of data that we can look at. What we've done is we've also categorized all of our stock by typology, so that we can sort of start to see that a group of properties might perform similarly and run analysis on it. And then also it's the basis for the 2030 average. So we're targeting an average of B across our stock by 2030. But we don't use it for individual retrofit projects. So when we want to do an individual retrofit project, we do a more detailed analysis. So we're using the PASS 2035 on retrofit projects, and there will be the full SAP, the full EPC calculation, not the kind of light touch one for that. At the moment, we're doing a piece of research on how much we'd have to enhance our current capital works for space heating reduction, and we're actually going to look at using PHPP is a methodology, passive house something for that. So when we're doing detailed pieces of research or detailed retrofit projects, we do use more sophisticated analysis tools. But when we need to look across the stock and have access to large data sets, the EPC is sort of just best.
Thank you, Sinead. Councillor Palace?
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. It's obviously a very, very daunting task here, and fundamentally we need a change of government. But just that's another issue when it comes to finance, really. But yeah, I was interested in terms of whether you can take us through the well, first question is about the sector as it stands and what capacity they have in terms of, you know, how large is the sector, how many contractors can we actually draw upon? And then my second question is just about whether we have considered at any point of incorporating this into DLO, and whether that would be an option, following off what Councillor Sedek was talking about. Thanks.
So how large is the sector? Right. So there's this thing I've mentioned called the Past 2035, and it's a really useful standard for how to do retrofit. And until then, I suppose there wasn't really a nationally recognised way of saying this is how you do a good retrofit project. But it also meant that if you said to me, is that a good contractor for retrofit? I'd have said, don't know, maybe I'll look at some projects or something. And so what it means now is that what we're starting to see is big contractors making sure that their staff and sections are trained up in this standard, and we can say to them much more clearly in procurement exercises, we need you to be able to deliver to this Past 2035 standard. And so I suppose the sector is, whether you'd say it's expanding in that case, because obviously a lot of them are similar contractors, but certainly we'd see what you might call a kind of a formalization of a retrofit contractor or a retrofit process, as opposed to just a contractor who'll do that kind of work for you. I think what's going to happen is most of the contractors are just going to upskill to be able to deliver to that standard. And so it's about an upskilling of the industry rather than an expansion of the industry. But there's still an awful lot of capacity to be developed. I don't have a huge sense of it. I think you'd really have to talk to a contractor to really have the insight. I do know that they've gone through a few unusual years in terms of recruitment themselves. So there's obviously been challenges. The construction industry was fairly widely hit by COVID because it's kind of work that often got stalled a little bit if it was internal, then got going because it could be external. It's been hit by Brexit in terms of workers maybe leaving. So there's definitely challenges in the industry there. And there's another one is that often, and this is another thing that's difficult around SHDF, is you get all the local authorities going for the same work at the same time, which makes it all kind of competing on top of one another. And so how that manifests itself is still a little bit tricky to see, but it is very very challenging. Ricardo, I see you wanted to add something there.
Yeah, just on that specific point, I think generally in the construction sector, the age profile of the workforce is such that by the time we get round to, you know, if the funding were available to bringing forward these capital programs, unless there's something radically happens in terms of throughput and the pipeline of people and well, younger people getting into construction, there is going to be a bit of a challenge with the workforce. So, you know, I think if you look at the census data, I don't think we've had the stats for the last census, but between the 1991 census and the 2011 census, the greatest proportion of workers in construction were over the age of 45. I think something like 45%, just over in the 2011 census was over were over the age of 45, and that trend has continued. So when we talk about capacity, it's not just those who are currently in the sector, it's also about the throughput and the pipeline of those entering, and the rates at which people are entering the sector isn't as great as it was in previous decades. I think in terms of the question on the DLO, I think that that's not something that we've considered today, and again, you know, would it be appropriate for us to be competing with the wider sector, wider construction sector? Could we afford to compete? Could we afford to build a workforce in time to enable us to, you know, deliver the significant programs that we need to deliver? I think hence why we haven't really considered that. But it's a fair challenge, and you know, there may be elements and, you know, smaller programs of work where we're talking about street properties, for example, where subject to skilling up the workforce, we may well be able to explore that. But at this point in time, I think it would be quite a significant challenge for us to do that for all of the reasons I've outlined.
Thank you very much. And final question from Councillor Joseph.
Thank you, Chair. If I may, just very quickly coming in on that DLO conversation, just to add my thoughts. Obviously, I'm guessing most local authorities in London are looking at retrofitting at the moment. So is a shared direct labour force something that could be considered with local authorities? That might prove more cost effective than Hackney just developing one on its own. Just a suggestion. But my main question, I suppose, was about over insulation, and unfortunately a lot of residents living in new builds do complain that they're too hot. So I'm wondering, how are we planning to avoid a situation where damp and mold are actually exacerbated as a result of retrofit? How are we going to achieve an appropriate humidity balance? Maybe that's too technical for where we are, for the position that we're at the moment, but I do think it's an issue of condensation building up in new build properties. And I just wondered if there was any plans to remedy the effects of overheating in existing new builds, perhaps with shutters, for example. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's not an unfair question, and it's something that is very much on the radar. I mean, strictly speaking, having the insulation causes overheating. What causes the condensation to build up is actually a lack of ventilation. It's surprisingly hard to build a building and know how airtight it's going to be. And so when they put in, if you build to a really good standard, I actually had this in an office building I worked in years ago. It failed all the ventilation standards because the builder was so worried about hitting the fabric retrofit or the airtightness standard that they overdid it. And then the background ventilation wasn't enough. We used to have to constantly open the windows all the time. It was a very strange situation. But I mentioned that the Regen team are doing a post-occupancy evaluation bit of research, and this is the kind of thing why I think it will be really useful to us, because I think it will kind of explore those questions about what the practical experience was. The other thing that we need to note is that when we are doing both retrofit planning and new build planning, we model it based on sort of standard people, because you don't know who's going to move into that flat. So there are, it sits behind the EPC, for example. It says, well, this home is probably lived in by, 3 people who heat their home between these hours in the morning and these hours in the evening, and at the weekend they heat it like this. And it's modeled that way. But that's not how everybody lives. So it might think that there's going to be 3 people in the home, and then there's 6 people living there. And that's a lot more cooking and cleaning and showering, which creates that moisture that has to be moved out. So the modeling that you do it's not trying to predict exactly who's going to move in, but we have to recognize there's that gap there. And that's why we need to learn from who's moved in, so we get that balance a bit refined. I think it's something that, generally speaking, is still a challenge, is just being able to achieve a really good standard without actually achieving too good a standard in strange ways. But it's definitely something that we're looking at via the work that the Regen team are doing. But the detail of it is extraordinarily difficult to unpick, really.
Thank you, Sinead. I've got a very, very quick one with regards to the pilots that are being carried out and the roadmap that's in development. Is there scope for it, once it's finalised, to be shared with the Commission, just so we can get an idea of the routes that you're taking and the timelines which will be associated with them, potentially, assuming we get a change of government, Councillor Mackenzie, and get some more money? The only determiner in respect of us being able to go like full on with this at the moment. And likewise, trying to get an idea of the pilot and the time frame in respect of finalisation, given that that's going to be a model for our approach in other areas of the borough. And is there scope to visit at some stage?
Yeah, I would have thought that the roadmap was probably going to be something we'd even have as a published document. For example, we were thinking of it as sort of an addendum to our asset management strategy. The SHDF works should start later this year. subject to somebody whose home it is agreeing, absolutely, it's really for them to agree that you can come around, but we don't have any difficulties with leading a little trip.
I don't know whether Councillor
sorry,
Mackenzie has anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, just thank you very much for inviting us to this session. It's really been useful in hearing your feedback and the potential pitfalls and challenges we may face. I just want to reflect on one of the earlier questions in regard to kind of like our residents and the impact on our residents and the experiences of previous major works. I think we need to start from my viewpoint, we need from the viewpoint of why we're doing this. We're doing this to make people's lives better. We're doing it to kind of like improve the environment, save the planet, which all our residents will be beneficiaries of. But specifically in terms of kind of works done to their homes, I'm fully aware that actually kind of when you do kind of major work, it's very intrusive, it's disruptive, it's bloody inconvenient. I've been in the receiving end of having new insulation put into my own flat as I'm a council resident, having door entry system and having double glazing. It means that for a period of time, your life is turned upside down. We fully appreciate that's a journey which residents are going to have to take. And our task is to make that journey as smooth as possible. It is something which we're very mindful on, but I think in terms of the benefits, from my own personal experience, having insulation put into my flat, have a double glazing put into my flat, it's transformed my life. And I'm sure that most people who are long enough being council residents to see these interventions, whilst in the first instance, it's a nightmare, but the long-term thing, there's benefits, as well as obviously reducing fuel bills in the long term. If you've got your heating on less, hopefully you'll expend less money on your bills. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us, Councillor Mackenzie. I think Sinead's going to drop off now as well. I'm not sure whether Ricardo wants to hang around for regen. Yes, no, okay. But thank you very much for this evening and being here. Thank you. Bye-bye. Okay, so I'd now like to invite James Goddard to give a brief presentation on the progress being made in encouraging and coordinating retrofit and promoting better energy use across housing association, private rented sector and owner-occupier housing stock. Again, going to have about 10 minutes to kind of undertake that before we move to questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Quick one, Councillor Garbutt, you asked about the size of the council. It is that in terms of tenants, but it's actually 31,000 because there's about 9,000 leaseholders. That makes life much more complicated for Sinead and the team. So just that 31,000 figure is technically the correct figure. So presentation's up there. Apologies, you may have seen this one before. We delivered this just over a year and a half ago. So apologies if you see it, but 10 minutes, I'll get going. So point number one, timing never works. What's to develop a new housing strategy for Hackney and a new private sector housing strategy for Hackney. We're doing that one separately because it's so important. Heard me say that last session. We are consulting first, we've already done a first tranche of consultation. We're doing another major tranche of consultation over the summer into autumn and a final round of consultation next year. We're talking to RPs, landlords, tenants, residents, the whole lot. Got quite a lot of data in so far. It's not validated yet, but the key points are retrofitting, net zero, climate change, and all that forms a massive part of the strategies. So a lot of the stuff I say tonight, some of it's in development, some of it's part of roadmap, some of it's working with RPs, some of it's trying to persuade landlords, and all of that. So you will see sight of this because you're going to be sickened to the death of me over the next 6 months because I'm going to consult that strategy to death with all of you so that we've got it right or thereabouts as good for Hackney for the next 5 years that we can make it. That is a frontispiece of the current strategy, by the way. We won't go back to it. So before you go on, Craig, there you go, Mayor Glanville and a happy new build family. We just love to. Next slide, Craig. Parity projects, top left-hand corner, a lot of the data you're about to see. We hired an outfit, Parity Projects, across London to do a lot of data in terms of retrofitting net zero. Data is key, it is critical. It's also really complicated and it costs a fortune. So I've got a 2-inch thick file on this for Hackney. It's already completely out of date. Well, not completely, but pretty much, as you'll see. This is why we have to keep doing this as we go along and along. It's summarized on these 3 summaries, which I'm kind of going to take you through now. So you can't really clearly see that. This is the baseline of Hackney. This was about a year. This is about a year old, so some of these figures have changed. Notably, the average SAT for Hackney is 66. That's an EPC measure. It's not bad, not great. We've got around 123,000 homes. Some of you will have heard me say this in the last session, actually, in the whole of Hackney. 2/3 of those are private rented and owner occupied. That's where the challenge and the task lies on those parts of the stock, even more so, much more so than the council part and the housing association part. I'm not going to pull punches throughout that tonight. 691 quid, that figure is way down. That's an average fuel bill in Ukraine, you name it, that's gone way up from what it was then. I'll just make that point before I get a question on it. There's a key sentence at the bottom. Nearly over 1/5 of properties in Hackney are in conservation areas. Leaving conservation areas are a significant part of the conversation in terms of how people have wooden windows, they have blue slate tiles on their roofs, they use Suffolk grey bricks. We've got loads of that in Hackney, and it's what we're talking about, the urban fabric, history and culture of Hackney. Conservation will make it very complicated already to do stuff, but we know that, we're working on that. Next one, please, Craig. 88% of the stock type in Hackney is flatted, one of the most flatted boroughs in London. You can't really see this stuff. The vast majority of our stock is flatted. That's a fact. As you can see, we're better in terms of EPC, F and G. Most of our stuff is C and B, which is okay. You'll ask me in a moment, this is in hitting, EPC A, EUI, passive house, all that, and I'll answer that. We're there or thereabouts the middle of the stock in London, but we are hugely, hugely flatted. So I think second or only third actually in London now. I think only Tower Hamlets have got more flats than Hackney does. Next one, please, Greg. And you can see it's pretty straightforward. For the vast majority of our stock, it is solid walls. Solid walls, I don't need to tell you, to keeping places warm or keeping them cold. We're in the realms here of cladding, whether internally or externally, if we take a fabric first approach, and we will be taking a fabric first approach to hit net zero. Where we have cavity walls, over 75% of those cavity walls are still uninsulated. That's pumping stuff in between the 2 skins. 3/4 of the stuff in Hackney is uninsulated. The top 2 bars on the bar chart constitute either solid walls or cavity walls. The bluey-grey one, the 4.4%, that's mainly the new build stuff, and that's mainly the RP stock, because system-built wall. System-built walls exist in Hackney, and they are complicated to do stuff with. The reason why that's important is because there isn't a straightforward way of saying the older the stock is, the more complicated it is. Because we've got new stock where there's a system-built wall where it's really complicated. Imagine, I don't think I'm overloading this point, but a system-built wall, for those who don't know, it's like a licorice ore sort. You literally see it in layers. You can have a piece of structural wall, a piece of wall that's there for thermal, a piece of wall that's there for fire safety, then the structure again. So you have these 6 layers. You cut into it, it's all sort. It's so hard to do something with those walls. You can't just pull the fire safety bit out. You've got to take the wall down. That's a major problem for there's one RP in Hackney that every single thing they built in the last 15 years is a system-built wall of that thing. Hammering them around fire safety, let alone damp and mold, and let alone retrofitting. It's going to be a real challenge for us. System-built walls. The council, by the way, does not use system-built walls. We've stuck the brick in all of our regeneration schemes. You'll be very pleased to hear. Next one, Craig, please. Again, it's pretty straightforward what this tells you. That over 90% of our stock is a boiler. About 60% of those are condensing boilers, Bosch Worcesters. That is the task that we face. How we change the heating systems after you've done the fabric, the heat pumps, all that stuff. And again, additionally, with terrace houses, some of the Victorian houses, you know, we're talking 12-foot ceilings, all that stuff. You can't put a heat pump in there, they just don't work. Simply they don't work without other measures put in there. Nothing you can do. So it's the way you treat the stock holistically. Again, can't pull punches on this. Over 90% of our stock is currently a gas boiler. Bear in mind, we've got targets. This map shows you where most of the TCO2 is tons per CO2. And this gives us an idea. This is 2 years ago. That's the most recent figure that we have actually for stock in London, where this is actually 21 update. You can see in Hackney, the darker the figures on the map are, the more CO2. That is the part of the stock that is privately rented and owner-occupied that we need to concentrate on. When I say we have no powers of intervention so far. I'll come to that in a moment. But we know where the CO2 is being lost to. We know where the inefficiencies are. Next one, please, Craig. This is overlapping the carbon dioxide by tenure. Can't really see it up there. I don't know why it came out fuzzy anyway. But again, if you would look at this, the conservation areas are where we're losing a lot of our CO2. They also map heavily, and the owner-occupied. Socially rented is uniform pretty much throughout the borough, but the depths of blues there, it's actually a better performing stock than both the private rented and privately owned. You can see the conservation areas cover quite a lot, Hackney. Right, onto the pathways. So we asked Parity Projects 2 assessments of Hackney, and it's a shame you can't really see the figures, so I will tell you what they are from my iPad in front of me. I know what they are, but if you, the column on the left is if we didn't whack 2030, 2040, but we did some interim measures, it gives you the sort of EPC you can expect and how much that would cost. That's about 1.325 billion quid just to get 30% of our stock sorted out. If you want to go full net zero pathway, on the right-hand side, the efficiency, heating, boiler, and everything else, the investment needed in Hackney 2 years ago was estimated at 2.5 billion. That's 2.5 billion. You can double that, and you can add 50p at least. We know that already. We have that scale of sum is unknown in terms of investment in Hackney. It is huge, and that's replicated across all of inner London and all 32 boroughs in London, as well as most of the cities in the UK. There was a discussion in the earlier presentation about whether, you know, what's the contractor situation, all that. The Parity Projects report does some estimates. There aren't enough contractors in our London boroughs to deliver that level of investment in the next 7 years. Again, I can't say anything to you other than that. We are way off of this. Even were we to have a government, a current one, maybe a new one, Councillor Mackenzie, I can't say, and they got the funding in place, we still have all the other things there, and I'm not dressing that up in any other way. This is a huge, huge challenge for all of us. Next one, please, Craig. These are the measures you require if you do it on the 2 pathways. So on the interim pathway, again, the interim, that purple block is fabric. So you just literally do some, and you stick some stuff around, you know, pipes in lofts and things like that. The orange one below that is the heating system. Net zero, a lot more into the heating systems. So heat pumps, electric stuff and all that, as well as the fabric to get to that 2.5 million. So it's actually a different approach. We are obviously, in terms of the climate action plan and the housing strategy, committing to the net zero pathway. There's no point in interim measure. What's the point? This again gives you the scale of what we've got to do and where we've got to do it. Next one, please, Craig. Private housing, these are the key topics. So again, you've seen some of these before. We've been consulting with both with landlords and with owners and with tenants, literally as we speak. Had some consultation on today about what people thought about net zero, what renters think about it, what landlords think about it. Key thing, sorry, about the sector, multiple owners. You saw a statistic last time where I pointed out in the private rented sector, 95% of the stock there is amateur landlords. That's people who own between 1 and stock. Only 5% of that is professionalised. That's where our focus has to be. Professionalised stock tends to be newer built, so it should be fire safe, it should be better in terms of damp and mould, and it should be better in terms of being able to be retrofitted. It may even be at EPC, but there are multiple and complicated owners. Even on new big blocks, some of those owners are literally addresses in Kuala Lumpur. We've had to hire private detectives to find out who owns them in order for me to serve a notice on them because of fire safety purposes, nothing to do with retrofitting. But some of the blocks in Hackney, we don't even know who the owner is. There are obviously very different incentives between owners, whether they be landlords and tenants, and between owner-occupiers and landlords. I was at a forum last week, which I barely got out of in one piece, where I was haranguing landlords to get around to some. They just said to me, I'm not going to do it. It's going to cost me so much money. What's the point? I'm pulling out, you know, or I'm going to put all of the costs onto the onto the tenant. One waved a piece of paper at me saying that she won't be able to get her money back for 17 years. So she's going to put all those costs over to the already overburdened tenant, or she's going to flog the property. Don't have straightforward answers to these questions at the moment, councillors, and I'll tell you that straightforwardly. I don't have powers of intervention. We can talk about licensing schemes. I'll come back to some of the things we've thought about, but at this stage, none of us have the powers to intervene or do something. Owner-occupiers, what do you do? We talked to owner-occupiers. Again, I had an owner-occupier in last week, randomly, and that owner-occupier, they had actually had a survey of their property, terrace house, over £100,000 to hit APC in the next 7 years. That's cladding, that's insulation, and that's a heat pump. It was £113,000. They said, just not going to do it. Unless we get grants, unless we get something from the government, we just can't force it. You know, what are we going to do? I don't have an answer at this stage. But we're just understanding these and what people are saying to us and how you can and maybe can't do things. And also point out, I'm politically neutral, obviously, but some of the hits to the grant and loan system, and I don't understand it. I just don't know why. The idea that technology is going to solve all this is complete nonsense. But we're talking to owner-occupiers and landlords all of the time. A final point on consultation, and again, I don't want to put it up here because it's not validated yet, but of the top 5 summary priorities that renters gave us, keeping warm was one of those top 5. It wasn't the top one, it was in the top 5. So it is an issue for Hackney. Transient population, again, we have a problem with a lot of that. We're keeping a good knowledge base with our renters. The population just moves. We can't keep the stuff there. We can't talk to. We try to get chairs of renters forums. They're gone within 6 months, things like that. So it's a much younger, a much more mobile population. They don't put pressure on the landlord sometimes, but they couldn't care less. It's as simple as that. And that's something we just aim at the landlord much more than the tenant. That point about older complicated, I kind of addressed that a minute ago when I said yes, the older properties in Hackney are much more complicated. They just are. Retrofitting those is a nightmare. In comparison with the new build schemes that I have on regeneration, these things are really, really difficult. They are really expensive. You'll know that. You've got 12-foot ceilings, you've got subsidence, you can put the retrofit in, and within 5 years it's moved again because the windows have subsided. But it isn't straightforward. Some of the new build stuff that we've been talking about, it's not just about system built walls, but we've got new build stuff. If I take you on a site visit, which I'm happy to do, Councillor, to drive some of our new build stuff, you will need to, when you've been in there for 5 minutes, we'll be stripping down to our underwear. It is so hot, yeah? That's not a good thing in a 40-degree summer as it was last year. We have to think about this because it means the behaviours of residents are changing just to keep, they're not opening trickle vents, you're getting damp, and we're getting HMOD cases in the private centre team in new build and new build stuff. Sometimes their interventions are done in opposition to one another. Grenfell, material used on Grenfell, ACM, is one, that material was used because in terms of thermal performance, it's one of the best thermally performing materials in terms of keeping a place warm. Of course, it's the worst when it comes to burning. And there's generally a relationship between how good it is at insulating and how bad it is in terms of fire safety. Again, this stuff is still being worked through, as you heard from Ricardo and Sinead earlier on about what materials, what technology can we use. We can use things like rock wool. Rock wool is great for passive house. It burns like Billy O, even when it's treated. We know that now. So it was touched on earlier, energy efficiency and fuel poverty, these are not the same thing. Other things you can put in place to tackle fuel poverty, and we have quite a lot of fuel poverty in this borough. In London, we've got the second highest level of poverty in London, and we've got one of the highest levels of fuel poverty. It isn't straightforward where you rip people's gas out and you put electricity in, you are not tackling fuel poverty. You may be hitting a climate target, you are not hitting a fuel poverty target, and we've got to work that one through. Regulation, it's all over the place. Government policy and government regulation on this stuff is a quagmire where it exists. It is all over. What are the targets they pick? I don't know what policy I'm supposed to be following from the government. I just don't know. I'm not going to pull punches on that either. Housing
Sorry
market.
to interrupt, James. We're going to have to kind of
I've got to hurry up, haven't I?
get to questions. Sorry.
Go on then. Housing market and values is going to be, that's really what I'm touching on about how our landlords say what's the impact on the market, where are the values, how do you get the thing lost, because landlords are telling me this is the final straw, they're going to pull out, they can't afford to do that, as well as licensing schemes. I was trying to threaten them with, we're extending the private sector licensing scheme across the whole of Hackney. I was trying to threaten, we'll look at one of the conditions of you getting a license to show us that you've got a pathway to getting your property. Agree. They, of course, have threatened me with a judicial review. Anecdotal legal opinion is that I cannot use the Housing Act to deliver a green and another Act's target, so I can't do that at the moment. I'll see what my advice is back. That was on tenure loss. Go on, Craig. Right, you can't see the rest of the pie chart here. That is literally the direct control we have over the housing stock in Hackney. It's 5%, it's our stock. Next one, Craig. You can't see the slide here, but this is all the stuff we have about working in partnership. I'm talking to RPs about whether we can share stuff. I'm talking about other boroughs. Most boroughs in London don't have DLOs. The vast majority don't have a DLO. How can we work together to do stuff like that? Your point, Councillor Joseph. Much of this is a straight rip from the Climate Action Plan. Everything that's is about how we have to deliver this through partnership working. We have very little direct control. Go on, Craig. We've been thinking about finance left, right and centre. We've been lobbying the government about energy performance stuff, green loans, you name it, and whether we can use MEES to enforce stuff in the private rented sector, minimum energy efficiency standards. We're on the case. We'll be reporting back. Final one, Greg. Housing strategy and private sector housing. Mentioned that. Stock condition survey. We do not have a current stock condition survey for the private rented and private owner occupied stock in Hackney. Got one, it's from 2017, it's out of date, that's a sample. Ideally, I'd like to do one for the whole of the borough, every single unit of stock. That's going to cost millions of quid. And if I don't get into each one of those properties, I don't know what I've got. Simple as that. We need a lot more in the way of action. Some of that stuff, it's all been summarised in previous slides. We need a funding system. Standard measures targets, your point, Councillor Garb, UI, EPC, a passive house. We use EPC by way of standard. Is it the right one? Probably not. You know, there are others that we could use out there, but we're using it because it's simply arbitrarily, it's been put in place. But you're absolutely right. Local energy plans should be there. They should state all this stuff. You know, again, this is how we lobby the government. And we're not any of this unless we have really, really, really detailed and working partnerships. I sped up on that last bit, Councillor Barber, shut up now. I'll say one final point, which is obvious. You can say to me, where are the RPs in all of this? So I've been speaking to RPs left, right and centre. The timescale's out for them. Not one RP in this borough has a current plan and part, the same position of the council. They do not have a current to hit EPC by 2030 that they're happy to come and talk to us about at this stage. So I've always said, well, what we agree with them is they'll do it for the housing strategy in 2024. They are in the same situation as the council. It's perhaps worse for them because their stock is not concentrated in one area, but it's a bit of a mess. What we are doing is we've divided them up into quarters of 5. So the top 5 biggest by stock we will get here. So you can have a look at L&Q's, Clarions. They do it in a very different way to us. They're doing it, their stock is spread across 4 or 5 boroughs, 4 or 5 towns, and they're looking at a business plan that way. Do it across 3 boroughs in London in conjunction with all of us as boroughs and get it together as one place. A lot of your stock is stock transferred. We know the data on that as well. So it's very, very much work. Not too fast. I think they'll pull it around, like the council will, but nearly 70% of our stock rented and is owner occupied. That's the problem.
Okay, thank you, James. Oh, shall I go with a quick one? So you just mentioned there that registered providers haven't yet locally, well, you said they're trying to do it on a national level, devised a strategy to kind of coordinate with one which we're undertaking in the council. I just wanted to find out whether the development of the council and housing association compact could help in terms of developing a collective strategic approach and also kind of influencing methodologies or sharing methodologies as well as a means of expediting their own processes.
Spot on, Councillor Adjari. We're using the compact to facilitate those discussions. So it will be done through the compact. The compact doesn't have an enforceable point in terms of any of it really, but it doesn't have an enforceable point in terms of net zero. But we're using the compact, not just the between the council and an RP, but between housing associations themselves. There's no reason, for example, why Peabody, I'm just saying them randomly, couldn't lead a consortia in Hackney that does work for others like the smaller ones like Southern and all of that. But these are live conversations yet. I haven't got an answer for you, Councillor, other than we're using the compact. What you've said is the correct question. Absolutely right. But none of them have got a business plan that is capable of being shared here.
Very unfortunate. Any additional questions? Councillor Palace and then Councillor Joseph.
Yeah, thank you for that, James. Data is extremely helpful that you have got, and it's obviously an extremely difficult situation. We don't have that many levers as the council, particularly with the private rented sector. I've got a few. I'll try and keep it very short. So on funding, planning gain, is there anything around that can be used to generate income for this? Also, are we looking at borrowing? I mean, is a capital borrowing? Is this something that we are considering as an option? And in terms of the planning issues, is this being built into all the local plans, like the Stamford Hill plan? So in my ward, as you will know, we do have a large proportion of the ward is a conservation area. Is this being built, into that? Yeah, thank you.
I'll do 1 and 3 together, Councillor. So the relatively straightforward answer is that yes, that it is in the local plan, and that for both new build and for minor stuff like extensions, PBRs, you have to hit good targets. So yes, it is. Again, funding, how you do it, where we go, all those things underlie. It's relatively straightforward to get in your local plan. It's something to deliver it, but that bit is reasonably tight. And you've seen the current local plan, the current SMART, you'll see it in there. Planning gain related, yes. A planning gain is a drop in the ocean there. In terms of these figures, it is in there, and Section 106 stuff as well. We've been consulting on the proposed changes to Section 106, the community infrastructure level seal. One of the points the council made was we don't want sight of net zero lost in that, which it could do. It would just come down to the brick and mortar new build thing. So you are correct. It's a very small drop though. Funding, borrowing. So our approach that we're thinking of is, as a council, what can we do? We're looking at, first of all, a grant-based system for the most vulnerable people. We used to have grants in the private rented and private owner-occupied sector, whereby we target the most vulnerable. We will put a charge. Generally, the way that works is you can't afford to retrofit your house. It's going to cost 50 grand. We give you a 50 grand grant. You've got no chance of paying that back, but we keep first charge on that. We keep a charge on the property when you die. Yeah. So we're looking at that. We have done that in the past for not net zero purposes, but just to bring empty properties and things like that back around. It's never straightforward. One of our biggest risks that we're modelling through at the moment is when you put the charge on the property, that's at real risk. The mortgage company comes first, family comes second, but you're about fifth in line. You can really lose your cash, so you've got to be very careful. But we're looking at a grant system and then a borrowing system from the Green Bank being worked through on the housing strategy. It won't be anywhere near 2.5 billion.
Idea of what you can get to?
So we are looking, in the first place, in order for us to borrow money and lend to people, we've got to register as a bank. We have to be a bank. And we are no longer a local authority, just a local authority at that point. We are a bank. So the bank, when we've looked at this before, in terms of creating a bank just for loans to tackle poverty, the starting point was 25 million quid. So again, we probably think it would be about 25 million, which is a tiny drop in the ocean too, but you've got to start somewhere. So it's one of the things you'll see in the housing strategy. We prefer a grant-based system to a banking loan system, but maybe it will be, loans to, you'll be income assessed and all that stuff. And generally speaking, when we've done it in the past, if you're classically asset rich and cash poor, you get the grant.
Thank you. Councillor Joseph.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much, James. Quite a dismal picture. In terms of your ability to actually enforce anything. I understand that that's pretty limited here. But you touched on the selective licensing scheme. I'm just wondering if there has been any more or less progress made in those 3 wards in this area of retrofitting, and if you think extending that licensing scheme could possibly enable you to apply some pressure or perhaps some incentives for landlords that were doing well, not necessarily cash incentives, but sort of like recommendations, that sort of thing, negotiation, I suppose, as opposed to enforcement. And I'm wondering if there's any in the current legislation or recommendations, are there any stipulations specific to HMOs, bearing in mind the relative disadvantages of the people living in HMOs and the high cost? Thank you.
That's good. I mean, they're the correct questions, Councillor. They just are. Licensing scheme, our intention is to roll it out across the whole of Hackney. That decision is reserved to the Secretary of State. I mean, I mentioned this last time, it's not within our power or control, but we are making a case to the Secretary of State why we need a licensing scheme. No licensing scheme at this stage is judged upon environmental factors. It's disrepair, conditions, antisocial behaviour. There's no consideration given whatsoever to environmental factors like this, which is wrong. Yeah, but they're not giving us. You can argue that disrepair and condition does come into it there, right? It's linked, but the state, the Secretary of State can make, and I know it's a he, so he can make his decision on one or all 4 of those. It could just be antisocial behaviour. It could just be poverty. That's the power the Secretary of State has. It comes down to our argument across all of those pieces, number 1. Number 2, we are looking at, and we have looked at, and we're speaking to colleagues about whether, I did mention it earlier, as a requirement for you to get a licence as a landlord, you have to do something like show us that you've at least got a pathway to net zero or EPC-A within a 5-year period or something. If you haven't got that, you don't get a licence basically, or we will withdraw that licence. That's what I'd like to do. As it stands at the moment, anecdotal legal advice is that I'd be JR'd and it might be dodgy. But this is a live conversation, Councillor Joseph, to which, yeah, we're still going through on this. If I can do that, I'll do it. Straight up. There you go.
Could you just extrapolate on that? Dodgy, how? Legally?
I can't. It's legally dodgy. I know dodgy is not a correct term for a scrutiny, but it's So the correct response to me is that I cannot use a Housing Act measure in pursuit of a measure that's social care or environmental or net zero or something. The legislation under the Housing Act, which allows me to do licensing, gives me no power to enforce net zero on an owner. That wasn't formally procured legal advice, that we will be procuring formal legal advice as part of our licensing scheme because of that. When I mentioned this at the Landlord Forum, I just about got out alive. You can imagine why, yeah? So that doesn't mean that I won't do it, but it means we'll have to do because what I don't want is for every landlord to put a judicial review on me. It'll just slow the scheme right down. And if we are threatened, and if a judicial review is allowed, like a year, it could take 2 years, the license scheme goes out the door at that point, yeah? But watch this, because we are doing all the data for the license scheme as we speak. Your final point was in the 3 wards. So the licensing scheme in the 3 wards, again, does not measure a net zero component at all. Doesn't do that. What it has measured is whether repair and condition has improved. Now, here's, again, an interesting point. We have got the data at the start of the licensing scheme in the 3 wards, and we've got the data as it comes towards the end of the licensing scheme in the 3 wards. Our consultants who have measured it have told us that we have improved conditions significantly in those 3 wards, such that if you were making the argument about conditions in those 3 wards now, you wouldn't get a licensing scheme. It's an interesting point. What we're arguing to the Secretary of State is you can't stop us then for having that licensing scheme there, because if we didn't have the scheme, disrepair is going to fall down again. So you have to have licensing schemes to keep conditions at a level, rather than just say, oh, it's repaired, it get lost. The Secretary of State's argument is these things are not permanent, and you've done exactly what it is to take things up to a level, at which point you've got to take it away because it's a draconian power. So these are a bit more technical, but these are the arguments that we face. So yes, I will be trying to wrap up anything to do with climate, greenery, you name it, into that scheme. Can't promise you that I'll get it, but we are looking at that.
Can I just ask a very quick one? Oh, yeah, sorry, Claire.
Sorry, I'll be so quick.
Councillor
I was just wondering, have you been compiling evidence of areas where the schemes have been taken out and then standards have declined? And that might be useful for your presentation.
Yeah, at the moment we don't, Councillor, because the licensing schemes in London, the all borough ones that exist, Enfield, Waltham Forest, Newham, have been re-rolled out again across the whole boroughs. Yeah, so they have managed to make an argument that gets through. Yeah, and again, I'm getting into this in detail, but we are using the same consultants and the same people who have argued with the Secretary of State and successfully got those schemes rolled out again as for Hackney. They're different schemes though, and one of the issues we're having in Hackney is, you may not believe this, but the private rented market in Hackney is a higher standard than it is in Newham or Waltham Forest, for example. It's a much higher standard. We're higher end now, and that sort of stuff is coming through. The Secretary of State will only make his decision, so he says, on the data that is in front of him. Nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with sticking it to a Labour council. It is, I shouldn't be saying things like this, I'm it is simply to do with the data that's in front of them. Yeah. And the data for Hackney is different to the data, for example, for Waltham Forest, which is why we're not just going on simplistically on one measure, but we're maxing them out across the piece. And that changes within wards. We've got wards where conditions are really good. We've got wards where conditions are terrible. We've got wards where poverty is down here. We've got wards where antisocial behaviour is way up there. So we're making a combined argument across the whole of Hackney. Final point, I know I'm on licensing here. For a ward to have a licensing scheme, you have to have over 20% of the stock in that ward privately rented. There are 2 wards in Hackney where the stock isn't at that level. So automatically those 2 wards will not be part of the licensing scheme. Hackney Wick is one of them.
Thank you, Steve. Councillor Garbutt, we are going to wind up, and then Councillor Palace, are you?
Ask a very, very quick one. Are we able to offer a discount to landlords who voluntarily would comply with particular kind of things around net zero?
Yeah, we are. So we are able, we offer discounts at the moment actually for speed of applying for your license. Yeah, so we do have within the fees and charge schedule, we can offer discounts. Yes, we can.
Great. I'm interested in how, because I know we've been talking about this being a green initiative, and I know you did mention earlier about there being the link with disrepair, but I just wondered how that is kind of spoken about with the sector, as in a fact that, you know, we've talked about this evening about it being really good for people's health and well-being to have improved, you know, these aren't just green measures. So I just wondered how that is spoken about with landlords or the, housing association.
We use as many arguments as we can. I mean, bearing in mind that at the end of the day with a landlord, it probably comes down to their bank account. Is the straightforward point there, Councillor Garbutt. So what we show to landlords, first of all, like with licensing schemes, we pitch it that this is better for you. If you are firstly you've got a Hackney stamp, that's going to be better for you in terms of getting people into your properties. You'll be able to advertise that. You'll be able to say, I'm officially approved by London Borough of Hackney. That's better for you as a landlord, number one. Number two, by having that stamp, you are doing, your condition of your property, the condition is not just about your bank account, it's not just about the way the market works. As you've just said, Councillor, it's health and well-being, it's greater health, it's all those other factors that then come in that you're dealing with your tenants on that also are helped here. I don't have a straight correlation between the one and the other at this point, but I do make the point, and we do make the point constantly. Where if I can get a whole borough stock condition survey, that's exactly what we aim to pick up. Stock condition surveys don't just look at the brick and mortar, they look at people. It will cost a fortune, Councillor, to do a whole borough one, and we probably, owner occupiers won't let us in. So we always have to make some kind of guess. People just say, tell you to get lost, don't believe you, etc. Without that data, I can't yet make a clear correlation between licensing, health and well-being, long-term climate, better for you as a market, better for you as a landlord. You know, if you don't tackle this, we're all going to go down the Swanee anyway. We say all that sort of stuff in terms of selling it. They will come down to what their rent roll looks like in the next 3 years always. We have pointed out, if your house is more energy efficient, then you make more on your margin, and we know that. We have to push every button, Councillor. It isn't straightforward. The other problem also is the landlords I get at the landlords forum are not necessarily the landlords that I want. They are generally the more responsible, more reasonable ones, because they pitch up to a forum out of some form of civic duty. It's the ones that don't turn up that I need to get hold of. And that's the problem.
Thank you. I've just got one more quick question. I'm going to bring it back to housing associations. One of my favourite topics, James. Given that, as far as we're aware, there is no strategic outlook with the majority of them, is there any push? Are we aware of any lobbying that's going on to try and bring them into line? And I'd say more so in the city boroughs like Hackney, where historically we've transferred a lot of stock over to them, and whereby we could end up with people in like-for-like properties, in similar circumstances, experiencing very, very different experiences looking ahead as a result of their failure to kind of step up and match what we're doing as a local authority.
Yeah, on the first point, Councillor, so the way the lobbying is working at the moment is we've got more sophisticated, and this is where the Mayor comes in quite well for his chairing of the, basically we've started to lobby through London councils. We do, I mean, I've lost count of how many letters I've written to Secretary of State on the Mayor's behalf on these particular points. I don't know, I think I don't know what happens to them. But what we've done now is we are working in conjunction with London councils, Georgia and Phil, to lobby as a much bigger group. It's not just London councils either. Some of the data, for example, the parity projects, the lot we use for Hackney and London, they've been doing it in Liverpool and Manchester, so we're looking at a much more UK-based a lobbying approach. But I've got to say at this point, it is about lobbying. It is not just about regulation, it's about funding systems, it's about those timescales. We lobby, remember, the industry is lobbying. Sometimes that's not the same as what we want, and organisations like ALA, Association of Letting Agents, they come in with a different view. They're trying to delay figures back on, for their own things. So there's a lot of lobbying going on. Some of it, as I say, is ongoing. But currently, all the lobbying is done through London councils in London. It's much more sophisticated than it was, and it's on all of those points. Councillor Mackenzie probably hit the nail on the head when he said we probably do need system change, because at the moment we're making very little traction, I have to say. Number one. Number two, you point about stock jowl by jowl and stock by stock. So firstly, I would hope that so we are working, there's 2 points to this. It was touched upon earlier where a lot of schemes that we do in Hackney are infill schemes. Leaving aside net zero, we have the problem alone of building shiny new properties right beside ones that are perhaps not in the best state of repair. Yeah, leave aside net zero. Just look at that. We are acutely conscious of that, and we try not to do that, but we are aware of that. We bake in inequalities to the system for the next 50, 100 years. We're aware of all of that. So we try not to do it at the moment, and the last sort of few years we haven't done that. In fact, we've stopped regeneration schemes that we're doing, and we've stopped regeneration schemes that housing associations are doing simply because of that point, number one. Number two, it's more how we use planning and how we use effective grant systems that have financial and planning legal control over any partner who thinks that they can do that. The third point is partnerships, liaison. Some housing associations are adjacent, they abut each other, and the stock type is very different. It's madness that they do things differently. It's madness that they have single business plans and stuff like that, yeah. So we are talking, and I would rather that we got the conversation going and we got the outcome right than that we necessarily rush it through for 2025. There's a long way to go though. We're using the compact to do that. That's our mechanism. I don't have any enforcement powers at all. But I think that's at this stage all I can say.
Thank you very much. I see Ricardo's going to have the last word on this, James. Thank you.
He is, isn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, so just a really quick one. I think just for the purpose of balance, I think with housing associations, James has touched on the lack of join up, and there are definitely opportunities for them to work much more closely with local authorities. But I do think that we also need to bear in mind that housing associations are facing some more unique challenges, again, impacting on their financial capacity. And I know a lot of them do have strategies in place, thinking about their stock more generally. But when they're having to also consider the significant investment required to remediate buildings that aren't safe, considering the emerging challenges around building safety, I think it does bring it into perspective. I think where we can do a lot better is particularly within a London context, is how we jointly lobby government together. And I know a lot of the G15 housing associations in particular are actively engaging with local authorities around some of the common issues that we share, so that we do go forward with more of a single ask and question to government around funding and policy and legislative support in order to bring these programs forward. But I just thought it's important for us to say that, because we're all on our respective journeys, and just understanding those drivers and challenges facing other housing providers and landlords, I think is always important to bring into these discussions.
Can I get a final 10 seconds
Is it going
on
to be
that?
very, very quick?
And I'll be
Councillor
really
Chair?
straightforward, because on that point Ricardo's made, I talk to RPs, chief execs all the time. I'm going to, again, not pull any punches here. We are having to prioritise fire safety above everything else. And in order, it's fire safety, then damp and mould, and then net zero at the moment in terms of investment.
And there we close this item. Ricardo, James, thank you very much for being here today. As ever, your presence has been greatly appreciated. Yeah, we'll see you, but we will be following up. Be assured of that. Thank you for answering the questions as well. So we're going to reflect on what we discussed here today, and obviously we're going to send through some kind of ideas and suggestions along the way, which hopefully you'll be taking on board and incorporating into your work stream in some way or other. And James, yes, I will visit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on. Okay, these next items are just for noting. Unless you've got a brief comment that you'd like to make. Agenda item 5. Accountability of registered social landlords, recommendations and findings, all enclosed within the agenda. So during 2019, 2020 and 2020-21, the Commission undertook a housing associations review, which looked at the practices and approaches of housing associations in Hackney and their relationships and partnership arrangements with the council. Last year, the Commission looked into a number of topics relating to the accountability of registered social landlords in Hackney, which included reviewing progress against the implementation of the Charter for Social Housing and exploring issues of local concern such as nominations and lettings, tenancy sustainment, repairs, complaints, safety and resident engagement. Commission has now agreed and finalised its response following these pieces of work. Members are asked to note the letter to the Executive and Housing Association partners in Hackney as included in the pack, which you've got to, go ahead, sorry.
Just a quick question. What do they then do with it? Do they just implement these points within their portfolios? Is that the idea?
To their methodologies, ultimately, yes. And we could obviously review and assess, yeah, and the effects and impacts of doing so, or not doing so, but hopefully of doing so. Noted. Thank you very much. Agenda item 6, housing support for care leavers, and we've got the cabinet response included in the papers. So in March 2022, the Children and Young People and Living in Hackney Scrutiny Commissions undertook an investigation into the nature and level of housing support for care leavers in Hackney. So that was a joint commission in which we also spoke with care leavers as well, who were situated in various types of accommodation, both in and outside of the borough. The Commission developed a report in October 2021, setting out 10 key recommendations for the Executive. The Cabinet response to these recommendations was published on June the 16th, 2023, and was considered and approved by Cabinet at its meeting last week, 26th of June, 2023. There are lots of positive elements in this work with some real tangible impacts that Scrutiny has achieved. However, there are also some less well-developed responses, that the commissioners will need to get some more clarity on. It'll be important for us all to kind of continue to monitor and review the recommendations to ensure that this remains a high priority. And I'll be meeting with Councillor Conway to plan and agree the next steps and update members in due course. Members are asked to note the Cabinet response and the next steps as I've just laid out and agree with those recommendations or not. Do we need a show of hands? Is that okay? Thank you so much. Okay, agenda item 7. Okay, the Living in Hackney Work Programme 2023-24. The following stakeholder groups have now been consulted on their views for the Living in Hackney Scrutiny Commission Work Programme. Members of the Commission, non-executive councillors, Cabinet members and senior officers, resident liaison groups and local residents. As you will see in terms of the pack, there is a long list in terms of our anticipated shortlist. So both myself and Councillor Joseph have kind of developed this based on suggestions, which subject to commission members this evening will be discussed with Cabinet members, senior officers and key stakeholders this week before the work programme is then finalised. The finalised work programme will be presented to you first meeting in September. Please can I invite you to note the shortlist for the work programme as it stands and make any comments. Go ahead, Councillor Palace.
Yes, lots of items as ever, lots of chunky stuff, which you'd expect from living because it's so massive. So one question and then general comment. I would be very keen on the intermediate housing panel being something that we do look at when they're ready to report. My question is, can we submit ideas for the panel to consider at this stage? So that's a question. And then the thing with the housing repair issue is, I think I did suggest at one point that a working group could maybe be established as a subcommittee almost of the committee to look at repairs. And I don't know whether that is something that could be. I just think the repair issue is just just massive. But I wonder whether within the repair issue there could be a particular focus on DLO and looking at whether that could be incorporated into a specific kind of session around repair. If we were going to do housing repairs, where we could have a specific focus around the DLO, what they can do, what they can't do, with direction of travel. And I don't know whether we're thinking about a review for scrutiny, but that could be a potential candidate. Just putting that out there without any notice. So there you go, Chair. But those are just some of my thoughts.
Oh, bless you, Councillor Palace. Okay. Before I respond, Councillor Maxwell.
Just obviously because I've been on Living in Hackney a few years ago, but I'm new to it now. Are we doing like because Councillor Palace mentioned it, are we doing like a large review on one area? Right.
Okay. What I'm thinking was, because we were going to have repairs as a quarterly item, and then in terms of data, then following up in respect of attendance from officers, there may not be a need for it at this stage to be undertaken as a review. But I will take on board what Councillor Palace has just said today, and I will consider that further. So yeah, and the other alternative was community halls, which is an ongoing issue. So we know there's a kind of pilot taking place in Kings Park, which may have been useful for us to look at. Likewise, bringing in tenants, bringing in other organisations who may want to utilise these spaces as well, making a more cooperative approach, Councillor Palace, to use of our community centres, which kind of expand who has access to them.
But we haven't got a list. We've got a list of topics, but not a list for the review.
No. So these were the kind of thinking. So potentially potentially community halls, because again, that would probably be a 2-session meeting, whereas repairs would probably be a 3, 4, maybe a 5 session.
Just to clarify what I was thinking. Yeah, I thought mostly could hear, but if you can't hear it, yeah, one was just about DLO as a specific kind of idea around can that help in terms of repairs. I guess what I was just saying about repairs in general is because, you know, I don't know what other people's wards are like. It's a perennial thing, particularly around communal repairs. We've got a massive backlog in one of our panels, and just about whether we could almost have a subgroup that met every even 6 months to just look at, like, where are we with stuff, where are we with, you know, with the statistics. So it's not a review, as it were, it's almost like a
the data presented to the main commission, but aside from that, this working group taking that data on board and then actuating other kind of areas of investigation.
Just
Okay,
to look at, like, where are we with, like, communal repair stuff,
Yeah,
like
okay.
on
Highlighting,
repairing the
yeah.
street property, a
Okay.
bit more of a regular deep dive idea. But whether that's possible is another
because it's
question.
officer time as well, and I think
Yeah,
that's the
yeah,
other
of course.
consideration.
Yeah.
I know you're nominating yourself, Councillor Palace, but go ahead, Councillor Maxwell.
Nominating myself for anything, not at all. It's just because repairs are no, really not. It's just repairs are just the perennial, and I think we need as much scrutiny as we can. That's all.
No, I also should have said, I correct myself, you're very passionate about this area of work, so thank you very much.
I suppose because repairs is a huge area, and I see about looking at the DLO. The flip side of looking at DLO is looking at the issues we have with some of our contractors. So, because I think we do need to keep an eye on the repairs and the damp and the mold issue, but often and some stuff is DLO, but we know that I think lifts are ones that are done by contractors, if I remember rightly. And I know there's often an issue because if it's something particularly specialist, it's very hard to have that in-house. Although Councillor Joseph's not here at the moment, the idea of sharing amongst other boroughs, I think, is also really interesting, because we wouldn't have the economy of scale always to have a DLO to do certain things because it's very specialist. But if you shared it across 3 or 4 boroughs, things like lifts, because it's gone quiet on lifts, but at one point there was a lot of lift issues. And I probably shouldn't say it, 'cause I'm probably going to get an email now of a lift issue. But, you know, these sorts of things are things that we're always told we don't have that in-house. But as part of looking at the DLO, I think it's like, I don't know what you think, Councillor Palace, but looking at it, the 2 bits, where we do need contractors, but the issues we do have with contractors, and then also looking at what we could do as a DLO and bring people in-house, but also what we could do as like a little consortium where it's something where it's specialist. Too much, you know, we don't need them all for us, but we could share. But I think was looking at quite a wide remit, so I think it'd be like narrowing it down. But I like the idea of DLO contractors and
Well, overriding issues at the moment, so, okay. Thank you. Any more comments? Councillor Sadek and Councillor Garbett.
It's hopefully quite a quick one, and maybe tricky to answer because I suspect it overlaps with a number of the themes that are already brought out, but something that residents bring to my attention, and I'm sure it's the same for other councillors across the borough, is the difficulty communicating with the council and with parts of the council at times. That, you know, thinking in particular about housing repairs or housing services, but it comes up in various respects. And I know the council's been doing a lot to introduce, say, online tools to be able to report noise, disruption, antisocial behaviour and so on. But I just wondered whether it would be worth at some point having a session or part of a session on that as a standalone issue, sort of communications with the council across the different modes of communication, telephony being the main one, but there's obviously various other ways to get in touch. To give a very recent example, I spoke to someone at the weekend who lived near a site that is going to be developed into council housing. She was, as residents in the area, were invited to write in to say, I want to be part of a group of people who are going to be able to input into this process. She responded enthusiastically. She's not heard anything back. She's phoned the council multiple times, not got through. It's that kind of stuff that I think has a massive impact on people living in Hackney. So it would be good to bring that out if we're able to.
Go ahead, Craig.
I'm not entirely sure that would fall within our remit. That seems like quite a large and cross-cutting area that might be better placed in scrutiny panel. I'm not sure what you think, Chair.
It would have to relate to specific areas in that respect that we cover. So housing, planning potentially, then we could.
Right, okay, well, I'm not sure what, maybe the suggestion, Craig, is better, because my understanding is that for various different bits of the council services, you come into the same hub, as it were, and then it goes out. So it is a centralised system in respect to a lot of these things. So just looking at that for housing repairs, say, wouldn't necessarily tackle the issue in the right way.
I just need to double check whether or not that falls within our remit.
Or central scrutiny, okay. All right, but thank you, yeah. Councillor Darbet.
Thanks. Yeah, fully support the point around community halls and that being really important for residents. I did send these on email, so you know what I'm going to talk about. And I did say it last time that I would really like us to do something on housing services for trans and non-binary people following the motion that was passed at council back in March, which stated that that's a particular group that we want to make sure aren't being discriminated through services. And I know we've mentioned there might be the housing homelessness strategy, but I know that that was one kind of housing strategy was one of our potentials, and I would, yeah, I think that would be really good if we saw that. And yeah, just where was the list? I am quite interested in us seeing the levelling up fund for Hackney Central, just if this is the only place that would be scrutinised. Is that? Yeah, is that the? And SEG, okay. And then, yeah, just to note, obviously we've had the feedback from residents who had inputted into the consultation, and Craig, I know you noted that it was like 98 and that was like the most we've had, which is really positive that loads of people are engaging. So, and I know that a lot of that was to do with crime and kind of like community cohesion and how people are feeling safe in their community. And I think that reframing of the antisocial behaviour one might be quite positive and probably links in a bit with what Councillor Sedek was saying about how people raise concerns about living in their area and have those things picked up, which I'd prefer that kind of compassionate framing to an enforcement one. Thanks.
Yeah, on Councillor Garbutt's point about the housing services to trans and non-binary, I'm just thinking on that it might be worth, rather than looking at a subset of protected characteristics, we probably widen it, and it's not just on trans and non-binary. We open it up to other relevant protected characteristics. But something to somewhat.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. The original point was much wider around housing strategy, which I support us looking at kind of access to housing for all protected characteristics. I was just pulling that out because of the motion.
Right, thank you very much. Yeah, lots for me to take away, obviously. Obviously, the housing strategy is going out for consultation potentially at the end of this month. There may be scope for us to kind of make some input into it post that period in some way, shape or form. Likewise, a suggestion with regard to the independent panel, which we're looking at 10 years across the borough. Obviously, it is independent, but I will check as to what input we can make at this stage, although the expectation is that with its initial draft, we will be provided with that and be able to kind of do so towards the end of this year. But I will get some further feedback in terms of start points, even though it has formed, but I shall do that. Thank you very much. Sorry, got one more item, I believe that's the minutes. Yes, draft minutes of the previous meeting of the 20th of April 2023 are included with the supplementary agenda, which I hope you all received. Members are asked to note and agree the minutes. Do you do so? Thank you very much. Agenda item 9, any other business? Is there any other business? Oh, you're too fabulous. Thank you very much. I now declare this meeting closed. Thank you to Craig, thank you to Mario, and everybody who said, yeah, and all the members of the public who submitted proposals for us. Oh, it's finished.